Hey there folks, today I want to share with you one of my absolute favorite techniques in the Scruggs style banjo language. It's something you've definitely heard before, even if you didn't know it, and you might not have done it before, but it's super easy and it's super effective. So, what is it? Well, first let's just take a look at what is probably the most common banjo lick, which we just call the G lick, which frequently goes like this. Now, that's what you would do in the right hand and kind of what you would do in the left hand. You're sliding from 2 to 3. You see that in tab books and different versions of things Earl's played or a million players have played. It's extremely common. But that's not really what it sounds like when you hear those players play it. It's kind of flat and boring, right? So what's missing from that? Well, it's a really simple thing you do with your left hand that totally changes the character of the lick and a million other licks that include that slide from 2 to 3. All you're gonna do is take whatever finger you're sliding with and you're gonna slightly bend the string as you slide. And it's gonna sound really weird out of context. Here's what it sounds like if I don't put it in the context of that lick. Sounds kind of out of tune, right? But that's actually what you want. You don't want it to be quite B flat. You don't want it to be quite B. You want somewhere kind of in the middle. In context, sounds great. Now just listen to those back to back and see if you can hear the difference. To me, the second one just sounds more like bluegrass, more like what Earl played and what people who studied Earl played. And what's great is it's not just that lick, it's literally any lick that you play where you're sliding from 2 to 3 on the 3rd string, which sounds like a really hyper-specific situation, but if you're playing bluegrass banjo, you know that happens all the time. So think of this, when you're playing, for instance, the B section to Cripple Creek, if you don't do that little bend, it sounds like this. Which is fine. But if you add that little bend in, that actually sounds more like what Earl played. It sounds a lot more musical to me anyway. It's a little bit bluesy. Between the B flat and the B actually makes it much more interesting. There's a little more tension, a little more attitude. There's all sorts of things about it that are great, but it just sounds better. And beyond that, it doesn't just apply to slides. Also, when you're hammering on from the 2nd to the 3rd fret on the 3rd string, you can do the same thing. As you're hammering on, you're bending with your index finger and bending even a little bit more with your middle finger as you land on the 3rd fret. If I play that original G lick with a hammer-on instead of a slide, it sounds like this. Again, kind of boring and flat. But if I add that bend in there, there's just that much more attitude and just that much more musicality to something that can otherwise be kind of flat. And that's why this is my favorite technique. It's such a subtle and small thing, but it makes such a huge difference. And I know the joke is that bluegrass kind of all sounds the same, but if you feel like that's the case, then you're really not listening because there's so many of these small little details that people are putting into their playing that totally changes the character of what's going on. And so if you go listen to Earl Scruggs, or if you listen to players that studied him, you'll hear this to varying degrees. You're gonna hear it in different places and to different extents. Not everyone bends it quite the same amount. Not even everyone bends it in the same direction. I happen to bend the string up towards the 4th string, but some people bend the string down towards the 1st string, and you're gonna get a slightly different sound either way. By the way, folks, if you want tablature for everything in this lesson, as well as all of my lessons, you can get that at patreon.com/EliGilbertBanjo, which is also where I post the bonus content that you can't find here on YouTube. Also, if you don't mind, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel and like this video. That's another huge way that you can help me make more of these videos. So if you do that, I really appreciate it. Anyway, back to the video. So that's all well and good. It's a relatively simple concept. All you're doing is slightly bending a string. It's not that difficult to do. But in order to get the kind of subtle musicality out of it, you are gonna have to practice it. So we should talk a little bit about the mechanics as well. And there's no exact science to how much to bend before you slide or during the slide or once you get to the end of it. It's all gonna sound slightly different. And if you watch players, they'll all do things a little differently. But the key here is that we're kind of going for somewhere between B flat and B. There's the reason that this doesn't sound great. When you just get to the B flat, it's fine, but it's not quite there. It sounds like it's almost bluesy, but not really. And if you slide all the way to B, I mean, that's fine also, but it's just very major, no blues at all. And what we're really going for is somewhere in between those two things. That's actually what the blues is, if we're talking about it from a music theory standpoint, I guess. But it's just a little bit more. It's just a little bit between those two things, those two feelings. So there's really no such thing as precision when it comes to this technique. We're not trying to land exactly in one spot, and we're not always gonna land in the same spot. But one thing you can do to try to get in the ballpark here is just check it with these other notes, B flat and B, and just make sure you're somewhere in between those. So when I bend this note, and then I play B, the B is still a little higher, so I'm somewhere in between those two things. And as you play this, your taste will kind of decide how far you want to take it. You don't have to always do such a extreme bend there. It depends what you want it to sound like. And the same thing is true when we're talking about hammer-ons. We're kind of going for the same effect in terms of the change in pitch, but what I like to do is bend as my finger is coming down. As I'm doing the hammer-on onto the 3rd fret, I give it a bend, and then I bend just a little bit more once I get there. And again, it's no exact science. I probably don't do it exactly the same every single time, but that's kind of the idea that I'm working with. Then once you've practiced this on its own, you want to start incorporating it into some of the other licks or patterns or tunes that you already know. Chances are something you've already learned just includes a ton of that sort of thing. If you know Cripple Creek or really any Scruggs style tune, you're going to come across either a slide or a hammer-on from 2 to 3 on the 3rd string. But you might also just want to practice these licks on their own. So here's just a small collection of different licks that include this, where it's a good spot to add this bend. And beyond that, learning those licks, if you don't know them already, you're just going to go through the things you've already learned and see where there are opportunities to add this in, if it really needs it. You're not necessarily always going to want to do this, but it's a really nice expressive feature that comes up a lot in this language. So another thing you want to do is listen really closely to the banjo players that you really admire and see if they're doing this and to what extent they're doing this. One of my favorite banjo players is Ron Stewart, and he does this all the time in a really unique way. So after listening a lot to Ron Stewart, I've found some ways that I can implement this in a similar way that he does. Not exactly, because I'm going to do things my own way, obviously, but that's where I find my inspiration. And if you go back to other players like J.D. Crowe or Earl Scruggs, depending on where in their career you're listening, you're going to hear the same thing in different ways. All of this just points to the fact that just learning the notes isn't really enough if we're trying to capture what it is that inspires us about this music. If we find it really interesting, then listening closely enough to hear those details is going to be hugely valuable. But anyway, that's much more than enough rambling for now, because you've got some homework to do with this technique. So check out Patreon, subscribe to this channel, all that stuff. But otherwise, that's going to do it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.